So now we're on to volume 2 of Ed Brubaker's run on Daredevil. This is still drawn by Michael Lark and picks up where volume 1 left off. Again, this is the second sort of fairly substantial trade paperback Ultimate Collection that they did of his run. So basically, following the events of the first book, we pick up and we have a look at Matt Murdock's relationship with his new partner Miller, who was introduced in Brian Michael Bendis' run. And what I like about this story is that it starts off showing how Daredevil's lifestyle basically affects those he loves. As you can see there. The only part of this that I would change, because you have Miller, you know, sat there wondering where he is, if he's okay, and all the rest of it. I think the placement of that sort of story arc is a little bit off because, again, it continues the sort of relentless sort of dourness of the first trade into this one. But it's not long before this book really does get interesting, and you see the character of the gladiator who's currently in prison, and he's been accused of basically murdering a bunch of guys. And it becomes apparent, you know, that he may, well, it raises the question, is it him that's doing it? Is he being mind controlled? Is somebody setting him up? And Matt Murdock, who's now out of prison and in the real world, has to try and figure that out. So again, they really, Brubaker goes for the sort of almost like detective film noir sort of tone with the mystery plots in this book, and it does actually go to some really interesting but very dark places. And where the book gets interesting for me is where you figure out that essentially, and this is a minor spoiler, people are being manipulated into doing things, and they go to some very interesting places with the character of Miller and do things that you really wouldn't expect to see done in a mainstream Marvel comic book, because by this point I don't believe this was published under the Marvel Knights imprint. It was just the sort of normal Marvel Universe. And it does get very dark and very sort of adult, you know, with adult themes and stuff. But they do go to some very interesting places. Again, it's more, you have stuff happen to the character of Miller to really affect Matt Murdock, and that is something I guess you always get in stories like this, you know, with a character who has a secret identity, the people in his life will be exploited and targeted in order to get to him. I do prefer it when writers try to play with that convention and that trope, but it is done, you know, quite well here. Like I said, it's more the sort of circumstances of what happens to Miller that makes this book interesting and really picks up the pace, although it does remain sort of dark throughout. But it becomes a bit more, the mystery is a bit more interesting than that was in book 1. So this kept me turning the pages, you know, a lot quicker than the first volume did. And it helps that really, I care about the character of Miller by this point. You know, she's been in the run, been in Daredevil rather, for quite a while, since Bendis' run. And here, both he and Brubaker, you know, do make steps to make you care about the character and fall in love with her, and you don't want to see bad things happen to her. So from that perspective, the character work that's sort of already been done up until this point really makes the plot work for me. It does remain interesting. As I said, the mystery is a lot more interesting this time around, and it's a perfectly good volume. I mean, the artwork again is very moody and stuff, as you can see there. It does have a certain, all the shadows that they use, that Michael Lark uses, it has a certain sort of Frank Miller feel to it, and obviously Frank Miller wrote Daredevil for ages, years ago, and pretty much I think every sort of modern Daredevil book has been somewhat influenced by Frank Miller's run. You know, either writers and artists are trying to sort of emulate that or to do the exact opposite, but either way, Frank Miller is like at the epicentre of everything that's done on Daredevil in one way or another. So this feels like that. I mean, we start to see the cracks show in Matt, as you can see there. I mean, I've heard people criticise this artwork because they don't like the posing of the characters in action scenes, but to be honest, I thought it was perfectly fine. I quite liked it. As I say, at times it can be a little bit too dark, but again, I mean, I really enjoyed this book. It certainly, makes it makes some moves to doing some permanent changes to, you know, Matt Murdock's life, and that's essentially what every writer in one way or another does on Daredevil. You know, they want to alter Matt Murdock's status quo permanently, and this book certainly does that. Like I said, through that sort of mystery, though, it keeps you turning the pages. So I would still, I'd highly recommend. This is where Brubaker's run really starts to sort of come into its own for me, and he starts to play with the character a lot more. So I would highly recommend book 2, and there is just book 3 that's left to review.